Hello and welcome back. All right, so we have one more adjustment to make to finish our clean edit, and that includes the tone curve adjustment. Now, another edit that I typically do for all my images is a lens correction adjustment. And we're going to cover that in an upcoming lesson, and we're not going to do that right now. So the other thing, as part of my workflow, I do have a preset that I apply that includes both the tone curve adjustment and the lens correction adjustment. And what I typically do is, before I do any of my editing, I will apply this preset as a batch process to all images so that I don't have to go in and make those type of adjustments on each photo individually. So in a future lesson, we are going to learn how to create those presets, and I'll show you how to batch process your images in ACR with that developed preset. So the type of edit that I apply to this preset is what is known as an S-curve, and it's my favorite type of tone curve adjustment because it adds a nice even amount of contrast in the highlights and the shadows, and it works for the majority of my photos straight out of the box. But if needed, I can always go back and tweak it for a particular image that I'm working on. All right, let's go ahead and go over the tone curve. I'm going to explain all the different ways that you can adjust it, how to use it, and exactly what the tone curve is all about, and why you may want to use this versus the contrast slider in the first panel right here. So our tone curve is made up of different parts. So let's go over all those different parts, and then I will explain how to apply the contrast or the S-curve to your image. One of the first things you're going to notice is this black line right here that goes from the bottom left to the top right, and that is the linear line that you're going to manipulate in order to add or remove contrast to your image. Then within this little gray box, we also have a grid area that you can use to help you align that linear line to in order to add the contrast where you need it. So over here to the left is where our black points or our shadows are. Over here to the right are our highlights or our white points. Then you're also going to notice a little histogram back here, and it's a little bit squished compared to this histogram up here. Personally, I don't really pay much attention to this particular histogram. Instead, I review this histogram as I'm working, and will also use my clipping masks instead of this particular histogram to see if I'm clipping any detail in my image. So in order to adjust this linear line to add your contrast, there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can do it from this points tab here, or this parametric tab over here to the left. So with this option here, what you're going to do is you're going to adjust one of these four sliders in order to increase or decrease the contrast in your highlights or your lights or the white points. The darks are your black points, and the shadows as well. So if we increase our highlights by going to the right, we can see this linear line right here is starting to get a little bit of a curve to it, and we're starting to lose detail in that area. If we manipulate the lights or the white points, then that line is going to be more profound with a bigger curve to it and affecting more of the image versus just the highlights. So if we go back to the highlights, we can see that it's affecting that line in a smaller increment versus the lights. So it allows you to control where you apply that contrast in particular points of the dynamic range of that image. So the darks are going to do just the opposite. It's going to darken the areas in the black points or the shadows or both. And again, it's going to be dependent on which slider that you use on how much or what you target within your image. So the shadows, again, is being limited to a smaller section versus your black points. Now with the point tab, instead of using those sliders, what you're going to use are anchors, and then you're going to lift or pull down the linear line in order to add that contrast. And you also have the option of using a couple of pre-made contrast profiles as well. If we use medium contrast, you can see these little anchor points here, and then there's a little bit of a curve here and a curve down here with a couple of anchor points as well, and that would be a medium amount of contrast. If you want a stronger amount of contrast, then the curve will be a little bit bigger on both ends, but the anchor points are the same. Or if you want to apply the contrast manually, you're going to stick with the linear option. Then to adjust that line, you're going to click on that line and then drag it in the direction that you want it. So right now the image is getting brighter because we're increasing the highlights and the white points, and we leave an anchor point behind, and that creates the curve. Now we can create another anchor point here, click and drag down, and we're adding contrast to the black points or the shadows. And this is what is known as an S curve because it has what it looks like an S along this linear line. The bigger the S, the more contrast you're adding. So if I bring the highlights up even higher and the shadows down even more, I'm adding even more contrast, but at the same time, I'm losing a lot more detail. So you don't want to go too far, and that's another reason why it's nice to have these clipping masks turned on so you can see if you're over editing or losing detail in certain areas. So for me, typically, I'm going to do a shallow S curve right about there. I am losing a little bit of detail in the highlights, but if I turn those warning icons off, we can see it's really not making a huge effect on the image. We still have some color in that area, and that's why I believe this S curve works well for this image. It's not adding too much or too little contrast, and it's adding a little bit of a pop to the image. Now, the other thing that you can do within this point tab is you can adjust individual color channels. Right now, we're affecting all 3 RGB channels. But if we click on this link, we can make adjustments to just the red channel. So if you're having trouble with your white balance and you're not able to find a neutral area with your white balance eyedropper tool and you're having trouble removing a color cast, then you can come into your tone curve and you can remove that color cast by selecting the color channel and remove that color cast based on that color that you're seeing in your image. So if you're seeing a lot of red in your image, then you're going to select the red channel and you're going to drag this down, and that's going to remove red from the entire image. But let's say the red is just in the shadows. Well, you can remove the red just from the shadows, but you also want to make sure that your highlights and your white points are still receiving some of that red. You're going to straighten out this part of the line as much as possible to make sure that that red color stays in there, and now you're just removing or adding red to the shadows. So this gives you more control and precision over color correcting your image and adding contrast to your image, and that's why I love the tone curve panel much more versus the contrast slider here, because we're really limited on what we can do with this particular slider. So if you want more control and precision over your contrast, then I do recommend using your tone curve panel to make those adjustments. All right, so in the next lesson, we're going to continue moving to the right in the editing process. We're going to go to the detail panel next. We're going to work on sharpening our image and reducing the noise and the digital artifacts that were created when we increased the brightness of the shadows. Plus, there's a hidden little tool inside your sharpening area right here that I'm going to share with you, and you're going to learn how to not over sharpen your image, and I'm going to share that little secret in the next lesson.